In a bustling, brightly lit classroom filled with lively students, one young boy sat quietly at his desk, feeling the weight of an invisible barrier between him and his teacher. Although he was excited to participate in his lessons and answer questions, he often felt as if he were overlooked. The teacher, Mrs. Harding, an older woman with years of experience, seemed to praise nearly every other student in the class, except for him. When he raised his hand, she rarely called on him. When he shared an answer, she often looked unimpressed or found small faults to critique, even if he was right. It was subtle enough that most of the class didn't notice, but he could feel it. One day, the students were asked to complete a creative assignment, decorating posters with themes about kindness and respect. His was detailed, bright, and vibrant, reflecting his artistic talent and effort. He was proud, smiling as he added the finishing touches, hopeful that this time his work would earn a bit of praise. When the time came to show their posters, he nervously approached the front of the room, holding his project with both hands, glancing around at his classmates, who seemed interested in his colorful design. As he presented, Mrs. Harding's face remained stoic. Unlike with other students, she didn't smile or offer any encouraging words. Instead, she interrupted his presentation, pointing out minor details she felt could be improved. She questioned his choice of colors, dismissing his explanations, and suggested he hadn't followed the instructions carefully enough. Other students watched, feeling slightly uncomfortable as she singled him out. When he sat down, a couple of classmates whispered to him that they thought his work was great. He nodded, grateful for their words, but also feeling a pang of sadness, wondering why his teacher could not see his effort and dedication. The pattern continued for weeks. Whenever there was group work, she would place him in a group with fewer resources, often leaving him with the tasks no one else wanted. Sometimes he felt as though she avoided eye contact with him entirely, as though he were invisible. Once he gathered the courage to ask a question after class, only for her to give a curt, dismissive answer that made him feel even smaller. When other students laughed or made mistakes, she would brush it off with a chuckle or offer guidance. But if he made the slightest error, her tone shifted, taking on a sharper edge that made it clear she had little patience for him. As time went on, his spirit began to waver. He found himself hesitating before raising his hand and second-guessing his contributions, wondering if he'd ever be able to impress her. His self-confidence started to crumble bit by bit, and even his friends noticed. They would reassure him, telling him not to worry, that it wasn't his fault. But their words only provided temporary comfort. After all, how could he truly believe it when the person who was supposed to encourage him seemed to care the least? Then one morning, things reached a breaking point. The class was working on a group project that required cooperation and equal contributions from everyone. His group had been working diligently, gathering materials and discussing their ideas. But when they presented their project to the class, Mrs. Harding barely let him speak, dismissing his parts as incomplete and not up to standard. She made a point of asking other group members to explain their parts in detail, as though they had done the majority of the work. By the end of the presentation, he sat silently, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and frustration, feeling as if he had let his group down. That afternoon, his friends noticed how quiet he was, unlike his usual self. One of them, a girl who had always admired his kindness, pulled him aside. She told him she could see how unfair Mrs. Harding was being and how wrong it felt to witness it every day. He thanked her, trying to hide his sadness, but the weight of his emotions was overwhelming. He went home that day feeling utterly defeated, unsure how to even talk about what he was going through. At home, he couldn't hide his feelings from his parents. His father, a man known for his gentle wisdom, noticed his son's downcast face and quiet demeanor as soon as he walked through the door. At first, the boy tried to brush it off, saying he was just tired from school, but his father knew there was more to it. After a bit of encouragement, the boy opened up, his voice breaking as he shared the long list of incidents, each one heavier than the last, detailing how Mrs. Harding had belittled him, ignored him, and made him feel invisible. His father listened, taking in each word with a calm intensity. His gentle face grew serious, his usually warm eyes hardening with concern. He asked his son questions, wanting to understand every detail, every incident, every hurt that had been inflicted upon him. As his son spoke, he noticed the way his small shoulders drooped and how his voice quivered when he remembered the teacher's harsh words. When his son finished, his father gave him a reassuring hug, promising that he would handle this. But the wheels in his mind were already turning. As mayor, he had spent years advocating for fairness and justice, working tirelessly to ensure that every resident in his community, regardless of background, felt valued and respected. Now his own son was being treated unfairly right under his nose, and he knew he had to act. This wasn't just about one student in a classroom. It was about standing up against injustice, about ensuring that no child felt the way his son did. The father sat quietly in his study that evening, a faint light illuminating the thoughtful expression on his face. He had spent his career serving the town with integrity and commitment, focusing on creating a safe and inclusive community where everyone, regardless of background, had a fair shot. But now the issue was personal. His own son, whom he knew to be intelligent, kind, and creative, was struggling under the weight of an invisible burden that he couldn't shake on his own. The pain and frustration his son had expressed that night had affected him deeply, and he felt compelled to do something about it. As he sifted through his thoughts, he began crafting a plan. He knew that, to address this situation effectively, he would need to approach it strategically, both as a concerned parent and as the mayor. He started by gathering information, beginning with a closer look at the school's policies on inclusivity, student treatment, and teacher accountability. From his years of experience, he understood that change often came from holding people accountable to their own rules and standards, and he was determined to make sure that every guideline was honored. The next morning, after dropping his son off at school, he reached out to other parents, some of whom he knew through his work, and others he had met at various community events. He chose a few close, trusted allies, explaining the situation in detail and seeking their support. Some were surprised to learn about Mrs. Harding's behavior, having only heard glowing reports of her teaching from the school. However, as they listened to his account and thought about the teacher's actions through a new lens, a few parents began to recall moments where their own children had mentioned her biased behavior. They hadn't paid much attention at the time, chalking it up to individual incidents or the natural frustrations of students. But now, hearing it all put together, it began to sound more like a troubling pattern. One mother whose child was in the same class as the mayor's son recalled her daughter mentioning how Mrs. Harding often dismissed her friend's answers in class. The mother hadn't thought much of it before, but now it seemed clear that this was more than a random complaint. Another parent noted that their child had mentioned feeling uncomfortable with how the teacher treated certain students, though they hadn't provided specifics. The father gathered each story carefully, knowing that these pieces would be essential in addressing the larger issue. Later that day, he arranged a private meeting with the school's principal, Mr. Everett. Known for his dedication to the school and his even-handed approach to discipline, Mr. Everett listened intently as the mayor relayed the incidents involving his son. He shared his son's experiences, the impact they had on him, and the reports he had collected from other parents. The principal's face grew serious as he began to realize the scope of the issue. He hadn't been aware of Mrs. Harding's behavior. In fact, she had a reputation as one of the school's more experienced teachers, someone trusted to uphold the standards expected in the classroom. But he could see from the mayor's detailed account that something was deeply wrong. The principal promised to investigate the matter thoroughly. Together, they discussed the next steps, including how to ensure the investigation was handled fairly and discreetly, given the sensitive nature of the allegations. The father expressed his hopes that, above all, his son could return to a classroom environment where he felt supported and valued. Mr. Everett assured him that the school took any reports of discrimination or unfair treatment very seriously, and that he would conduct a full review of Mrs. Harding's conduct. To ensure the investigation was as transparent and unbiased as possible, Mr. Everett contacted the district's educational board, requesting an independent observer to help with the review. The observer would sit in on Mrs. Harding's classes to gather first-hand insights into her teaching style and interactions with students. This, they hoped, would prevent any bias in the process and would help them identify any concerning behaviors. While this was underway, the principal also reviewed feedback from previous student evaluations, looking for signs he might have missed. Word of the investigation began to circulate quietly among the school's staff. Some teachers who had witnessed Mrs. Harding's behavior began to come forward, sharing their own observations. A few mentioned feeling uneasy about her tendency to single out certain students, though they had never felt comfortable enough to say anything directly. With this additional information, the principal and the district observer were able to build a clearer picture of her conduct. Meanwhile, the mayor spoke to his son, updating him on the steps he was taking. He didn't want his son to feel pressured or overwhelmed, so he assured him that everything was being handled professionally. The boy felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. While he was grateful for his father's support, he couldn't help but feel anxious about how Mrs. Harding might react if she found out about the complaints. In the following days, the district observer attended Mrs. Harding's classes, including those in which the mayor's son was a student. The observer's presence brought a sense of quiet tension to the classroom, and Mrs. Harding was visibly more careful in her interactions. The students, though curious about the new presence, didn't fully understand the reason for it. However, the mayor's son noticed that Mrs. Harding's behavior was suddenly more reserved. She made an effort to include him in discussions and even offered him a rare word of encouragement. Though it felt strange, he tried to enjoy the newfound respect, even if it seemed slightly forced. Behind the scenes, the investigation continued. The principal and the observer reviewed the evidence collected from both students and parents, building a compelling case that showed the impact of Mrs. Harding's actions. Though she hadn't made overtly discriminatory remarks, her behavior had created an environment where certain students felt excluded and unfairly treated, a situation that was unacceptable for the school and its values. When the investigation concluded, Mr. Everett called the mayor to inform him of their findings. Mrs. Harding's behavior had indeed crossed the line of professionalism, and they were prepared to take action. She would be required to attend mandatory training on inclusivity and bias, and her interactions with students would be closely monitored to ensure a more positive classroom environment. The school would also conduct regular checks across all classes to prevent such issues in the future. The father felt a sense of relief and pride in knowing that his actions had made a difference not only for his son, but for other students who had faced similar treatment. He knew that this was a first step toward creating a better, fairer environment for everyone. On a crisp morning, a few weeks after the investigation had concluded, Mrs. Harding received a formal letter from the school district. It outlined the results of the investigation and listed the corrective measures she was required to complete before the semester's end. The letter stated in firm but polite language that she had breached the school's standards for fair and inclusive teaching and that her behavior toward specific students had been unacceptable. As she read through the letter, a mixture of disbelief and indignation flickered across her face. She had never imagined that her treatment of a single student would lead to such a detailed investigation. But the weight of her actions was now clear, and the consequences were non-negotiable. One of the stipulations in the letter required Mrs. Harding to attend multiple workshops on inclusivity, implicit bias, and equitable treatment in the classroom. These workshops were designed not only to address specific behaviors, but also to encourage teachers to reflect on the unseen biases that might influence their interactions with students. As someone who prided herself on her many years of teaching, Mrs. Harding was initially resistant to the idea. She had always believed that she treated her students fairly, even if she occasionally pushed them harder to toughen them up. Yet as she read further, she began to realize that this was no longer a matter of her perspective alone. The school had decided that her approach needed to change. The workshops began a few days later, hosted by a training facilitator who specialized in promoting inclusive educational practices. Mrs. Harding joined a small group of other teachers from around the district, each of whom had been required to attend for various reasons. At first, she felt defensive, listening to the facilitator explain how seemingly small biases could have profound effects on students' self-worth and learning. The idea of implicit bias was a new concept to her, and she resisted the notion that her actions had been influenced by unconscious prejudices. But as the training progressed, she found herself growing quieter, recognizing certain patterns in her own behavior as the facilitator described common, unintentional biases that often affect students from marginalized backgrounds. During one exercise, each teacher was asked to reflect on moments when they may have judged a student too quickly or expected less from them based solely on appearance or background. Mrs. Harding thought back to her interactions with the mayor's son, remembering the many instances where she had dismissed his work or chosen to correct him publicly rather than encourage his efforts. She was struck by the memory of how she had interrupted him during his poster presentation, remembering his face as he stood there, eager to share his project but clearly affected by her cutting remarks. For the first time, she began to see herself from the perspective of her students, and a faint but growing sense of guilt settled over her. Meanwhile, the principal ensured that Mrs. Harding's classroom was under close supervision. He arranged for periodic, unannounced visits from administrators and district observers to monitor her interactions with all students, especially those who had previously felt marginalized. These visits were intended to keep her accountable and ensure that she was genuinely implementing the new practices she was learning in her workshops. Over time, the observers noted gradual changes in her behavior. She had become more attentive and inclusive in her responses, making an effort to engage all students equally and praise their efforts without unnecessary criticism. The mayor's son also began to notice a difference. Mrs. Harding, who had once barely acknowledged his presence, now greeted him with a nod each morning and occasionally checked in to see if he understood the lesson. The abrupt shift felt strange at first, and he couldn't help but be wary, wondering if her behavior was genuine or just an act. But as the weeks went on, he began to feel a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, he could participate in class without the constant fear of being singled out or criticized. Gradually, he regained some of the confidence he had lost, raising his hand more often and sharing his ideas without hesitation. The other students in the class sensed the change as well. They noticed that Mrs. Harding was more even-handed in her discipline, no longer favoring certain students while ignoring others. She began offering positive feedback, encouraging everyone to do their best rather than holding specific students to harsher standards. The class atmosphere improved, with students feeling more comfortable and less anxious about participating. The mayor's son, in particular, found himself thriving. His grades improved, and he started to enjoy school again, building friendships with classmates who had once been too intimidated to reach out. One afternoon during a parent-teacher conference, Mrs. Harding had the opportunity to meet with the mayor and his wife in person. She was nervous, aware of the discomfort that hung between them. She knew that her actions had directly impacted their son and had caused unnecessary harm. As they sat down, she took a deep breath, prepared to address the situation. "I want to thank you for meeting with me," she began, her voice a bit hesitant. "I also want to express my sincere apologies to your son and to you both. I've spent time reflecting on my actions, and I realize now how my behavior was hurtful and unfair." The mayor listened, watching her closely as she spoke. He appreciated her words, though he was cautious, hoping that her apology was genuine and that her behavior had truly changed. "My son means the world to us," he replied gently but firmly. "All students deserve to feel safe, respected, and valued in the classroom. It's reassuring to hear that you understand the impact this has had on him and on us." She nodded, humbled by his response, and promised to continue her efforts to create a more supportive environment for all her students. The mayor left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic, hopeful that Mrs. Harding's transformation would extend beyond mere words and last for years to come. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Harding continued to apply the insights she had gained from the workshops. She became known among the staff for her newfound commitment to inclusivity and fairness, even volunteering to mentor new teachers on creating positive classroom environments. Her transformation was not lost on the students either, especially those who had felt the brunt of her past behavior. The mayor's son noticed her efforts and, with time, even began to trust her guidance, feeling reassured by her consistent kindness and support. The school community, too, was positively affected by the events that had unfolded. Students and teachers alike understood that the administration was serious about addressing unfair treatment and creating an inclusive environment. The principal introduced new policies to regularly review teachers' interactions with students, ensuring that no child felt isolated or mistreated in the future. Parents felt reassured, knowing that the school would now act swiftly and justly should similar issues arise. For the mayor and his son, the experience became a story of resilience, advocacy, and change. They saw how one voice, when lifted courageously, could challenge even long-standing injustices and create a path for a brighter, more inclusive future for everyone in the community. And for Mrs. Harding, it was a reminder of the power and responsibility that came with her role as a teacher, a role she would now approach with greater humility, awareness, and empathy. In the weeks that followed Mrs. Harding's transformation, the classroom slowly evolved into a place that felt warmer, more welcoming, and filled with the sounds of engaged, curious students. The tension that had once filled the room lifted as students noticed the positive changes in their teacher's approach. The mayor's son, who had once dreaded going to school, now found himself excited to participate. He could feel a subtle but powerful shift in Mrs. Harding's demeanor. Her smiles no longer seemed forced, and her encouragement felt genuine. Her sharp, critical tone was replaced by a gentler, more understanding one, and she listened intently whenever he or other students spoke. For the first time, he felt seen and appreciated, not only for his work but for who he was. The impact of this change extended far beyond Mrs. Harding's classroom. Students from different grades started to hear about the efforts that had been made to make the school environment more inclusive. The principal, Mr. Everett, took a proactive approach, organizing regular staff meetings where teachers were encouraged to share their experiences and discuss best practices for creating an equitable environment. Inspired by what had happened in Mrs. Harding's class, the faculty and staff began developing new strategies to ensure that every student felt valued and included, regardless of their background or abilities. One significant step the school took was to implement a peer mentorship program. Older students were paired with younger ones, creating a network of support that extended across grade levels. The mayor's son, now empowered by his own experience, became one of the first volunteers, eager to make a difference for other students who might be struggling. He quickly bonded with a younger student who reminded him of himself, a quiet, reserved child who needed a bit of encouragement to feel confident. With gentle support, he helped his mentee feel comfortable speaking up in class and encouraged him to express his ideas. It became a meaningful friendship, and in helping his mentee, the mayor's son found his own voice growing stronger. Seeing the positive effects on the students, Mr. Everett decided to make changes at the administrative level as well. He worked with the school board to institute a new policy requiring annual inclusivity training for all teachers and staff. This training wasn't just about preventing discrimination. It focused on understanding each student's unique perspective, fostering empathy, and promoting diversity as a strength within the school community. Teachers were encouraged to celebrate students' different backgrounds, talents, and contributions, recognizing that each child brought something special to the classroom. This shift in the school's culture began to have a ripple effect throughout the town. Parents noticed how their children returned home with stories of collaborative activities, moments of inclusion, and experiences where they felt appreciated for who they were. The mayor received messages from parents who expressed their gratitude, sharing how the new environment at school had positively influenced their children's confidence and outlook on learning. Inspired by this feedback, he knew that his role as mayor could help support these efforts at a broader level. He worked with the local council to introduce town-wide programs that promoted cultural understanding, empathy, and respect among young people. The community started hosting events that celebrated diversity, from music and art fairs to heritage festivals, allowing students to share their backgrounds proudly. As part of this broader initiative, the school began celebrating a new annual Unity Day, a special event where students, parents, and teachers came together to honor each other's unique backgrounds. Students were invited to bring in artifacts, photos, or food that represented their heritage, sharing stories and learning from one another in a colorful showcase of the town's diversity. The mayor's son, whose confidence had grown immensely, prepared a small presentation about his family and what his father's role as mayor meant to him. Standing in front of his classmates and their families, he spoke about the importance of standing up for what was right and shared how his father's example had inspired him to be brave, even when it was difficult. Mrs. Harding, who attended Unity Day with a sense of humility and gratitude, was deeply moved by the celebration. She watched as her students shared their stories and proudly displayed aspects of their cultures, seeing them as individuals with rich backgrounds and dreams. She realized how much she had grown, not only as a teacher, but as a person, and understood that her students had become her greatest teachers. The event was both a culmination of her journey and a reminder of her ongoing commitment to growth and self-reflection. In time, the changes that had started in Mrs. Harding's classroom began to echo throughout the town's educational system. Schools in neighboring areas took note of the success at the mayor's son's school, and some reached out for guidance, curious to learn how they could implement similar programs. The district began sharing resources, creating a network of support among schools to promote inclusivity and respect on a broader scale. Workshops, mentorship programs, and unity days became common across the district, building a community where every student felt they had a voice and a place to belong. The mayor's son carried the lessons he had learned through this experience with him, not only in his academic journey, but in his friendships and future aspirations. He grew into a confident young leader, respected by his peers for his kindness and integrity. His experience with Mrs. Harding's transformation instilled in him a deep understanding of the importance of empathy, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what is right. He became someone others turned to for support, a young leader who embodied the values his father had always championed. The mayor, too, found himself deeply changed by the experience. He realized how even small actions, like listening to his son's pain and taking a stand against unfair treatment, could have far-reaching effects. As a leader, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his role in the community was more than policymaking. It was about creating an environment where people of all backgrounds could thrive. He continued to advocate for policies that supported schools, parents, and students, using his position to encourage understanding and equality in every corner of the town. For Mrs. Harding, the experience served as a powerful reminder of the responsibility teachers hold in shaping their students' lives. She no longer viewed her role as merely imparting knowledge. She understood that her actions could either build or break a student's spirit. Each morning, she entered her classroom with a renewed sense of purpose, greeting every student with genuine warmth and listening to their stories, perspectives, and ideas. Over time, she earned back their trust and respect, becoming a beloved teacher known for her kindness and commitment to fairness. The story of the mayor's son in Mrs. Harding's classroom spread throughout the community as a tale of resilience, redemption, and the power of standing up for what is right. It was a story that taught parents, students, and teachers alike that change was possible, that even deeply ingrained patterns could be broken, and that growth often came through facing uncomfortable truths. The town became a place where unity and respect were not just values spoken about in classrooms, but principles lived out every day in the halls, parks, and homes. In the end, what began as a painful experience for one boy became a transformative journey for an entire community. And every time the mayor looked at his son, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not only in the young man he was becoming, but in the hope that this story would inspire others to believe in the power of change, justice, and unity.